Most people see colors, but not everyone, or at least some people have what we can call color deficiencies. Even people that have normal color vision, do they really see the same colors the same way? Let's see if we can figure that out by looking at how the human eye works. Here's a cross-sectional diagram of the human eye. Light would come in through the cornea, pass through the opening called the pupil and through the lens and be focused on the back of the eye, which is generally known as the retina. Now it passes through a gel-like substance on its way, and the back of the eye where the arrow is touching is known as the macula. That's part of the retina where your center of vision is concentrated. So around the macula and the fovea in particular is where we get most of our color reception. Among the cells that are in the retina are the cones and the rods. These two cells receive light and basically vibrate. Those that vibrate more from color are the cones, and those that vibrate mostly just from light versus dark are known as the rods. So the cones help us to see color, where the rods are more about seeing black and white and gray, and also are very sensitive to movement, seeing movement. The previous diagram is highly stylized. Here's an actual electron micrograph of what rods and cones might look like. And you can see the cones are named because one end of them is rather cone-shaped, whereas the rods have a rod-shaped end. So basically the rods and the cones and several other types of cells make up the retina, and whenever light strikes the back of the eye, these cells might respond to it depending on the wavelengths. Here are the first letters of the main colors of the spectrum that humans can see: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Sometimes people leave indigo out, but it is its own color. As you can see here on the left, that's indigo, whereas violet is on the right. This is a graphical representation of the sensitivity of the different cells in the retina. There's three types of cones. One which is most sensitive to light in the red and orange spectrum, around 564 billionths of a meter, or nanometers. There's one that's more sensitive in the green region, 533 nanometers is its peak efficiency. And then there's one in the blue region, 437 nanometers. Now you can see that they overlap. The darker line represents the main region that the rods respond to. But again, their main function is to differentiate between light and dark rather than to see color. So again, there's three types of cones. You can't necessarily tell which one's which by looking at them, but if you hook them up to an electric meter, you could see which regions they vibrate most strongly to. Here's another depiction of the sensitivity versus wavelength curves, just cleaned up a little bit. And you can see in particular the red and the green have a lot of overlap, whereas the blue only overlaps a little bit with the green and almost not at all with the red in their sensitivities, how much light they respond to, or which wavelength of light they respond to the most. Now you also notice maybe at the top of the graphs there it says normal trichromat. So trichromat means three colors. So believe it or not, we see all the different colors that we see based on combinations of the response of these three types of cells, these three cones. So we don't have a cone for, say yellow. We don't have a cone for orange. But what might happen is that orange or yellow would make both red and green cones vibrate. And depending on that vibration, that's how the brain interprets which color you see. Just FYI, as I alluded to earlier, the retina has these cells, the rods and the cones, but the cones are especially concentrated around the fovea region. So that's where we see color the best, when you're looking directly at something. As opposed to the rods, they're kind of scattered all over the place, but there's very few cones on the outer edges. So those regions are most receptive to seeing light versus dark and provide a quick response to any changes in illumination. In other words, if you go from, say, light into the shade, it's the rods that help you to see during that transition. This is just a normal, well, what you might depict the distribution of rods and cones to look like in a normal color vision or trichromat person. So you see a lot of red cones, a lot of green cones, and some blue cones in the fovea region. Now again, this is not what it would actually look like if you saw the back of the eye, but it does give you sort of a graphical depiction that the red and green cones in particular outnumber the blue cones by a factor of about 10 to 1. So we actually see anything down between red and green, so that includes orange and yellow, we actually see those colors probably better than we see on the blue end of the spectrum in general, if your cones are working normally, which they don't always do. So in the fovea region in particular, there's very few, if any, blue light receptors. So there's various theories about how vision works, but basically it seems that there's sort of two ways you can see a particular color. So if it's red, green, or blue, it's pretty obvious that if you had blue light, it would make the blue cone vibrate, and so it would send a signal to your brain, and your brain would say, hey, that's blue. If you get green light, it makes the green cone vibrate, but it also makes the red cone vibrate. So it's just a matter of your brain interpreting which one is vibrating most strongly. And of course, if you get red light, then it's sort of like with the green. There's a lot of overlap between red and green. But if the red's vibrating most strongly, then your brain will interpret that as red. But what happens if you get that overlap? What if you get, say, some light that came in, well, look there on the graph, at say around 500, 550, then you're going to make both the red and the green cones vibrate. So it won't vibrate as much as if you had a pure green or a pure red, but your brain is able to interpret both of those vibrations at the same time, and it combines them into a single color. So right there, that represents 550. And 550, your brain would interpret probably as some form of yellow if you have normal color vision, because it's vibrating pretty strongly both the red and the green cones at the same time. So in other words, we don't have a cone that vibrates strongly in the yellow region. We have two that vibrate strongly there. And if both of them are vibrating strongly, that's when your brain says, hey, that's yellow. So in this trichromic or chromatic theory of color vision, the brain interprets the relative amounts of signals that it's receiving from each of the three cone types. That means that some colors can be matched by a pair of wavelengths. In other words, we see something yellow. It could be because it is yellow, but it could be that it's both red and green. That means that any color can potentially be matched by mixing 2 or 3 different wavelengths. I'll come back to that idea of how 2 or 3 colors can combine into a single color in our brains in just a minute. But first, I want to emphasize again that while most people have three types of cones and they have the right number. Not everybody does. There's probably 4 or 5%, especially in men, who have some sort of deficiency in either the number of cones or the functioning of their cones. So for example, if somebody is missing a functional type of cone, you're only going to have two, they might be called a dichromat. If somebody's missing two types of cones, they're called a monochromat. And there's a very rare condition where somebody can only see basically black and white. They're called a rod monochromat. The most common form of what we might call color blindness, or a better term would be color deficiency, happens mostly in men. It's called deuteranopathy. It's basically their red and green are not necessarily, their cones are not missing, but they overlap too much. So they basically fire both at the same time. And so if their green cone in particular, which has the chromosomes, is the X chromosome, and men only get one X. So if they get a mistake on that gene on the X chromosome, then their green overlaps too much with the red. They can't distinguish green from red. And so it's best when you're making presentations not to use greens and reds, actually, because you're going to be thinking that you're making something very colorful, but for about 3% of men in particular, they're not going to be able to see those nice colors the same way that you intend. They'll see something, it just is not in the same way that people with 3 working cones and the right number of cones see. So this is a hereditary deficiency. That's the most common one. The red or green cone peak sensitivity is shifted and or absent. So if you're, again, making a presentation, you have to keep that in mind. That top one right there, some men might be having a hard time reading that. In fact, it says this is difficult to read because they can't readily distinguish that red and that green. The yellow one is a little easier to read, the yellow writing, because they can see yellow, since the red and the green and a lot of those people overlap too much. Yellow is pretty easy to see, but it'd be a lot easier to see the yellow if it was really contrasted with something like, say, the black there at the bottom of the screen. So just if we were in person, I might show you these slides. I don't know how this is going to work on the screen, but let's take a look at some little graphical tests to see how well your color vision works. So if you're looking at this image, do you see a number spelled out in one color, whereas there's a background, a green background? People with normal trichromatic cone sensitivity and most other color deficiencies can actually see this as a 12. But what about this number? Can you see that one? What was your first thing that you thought you saw when you looked at that? If you have normal color vision, you probably had absolutely no problem picking that out as an 8. But if you have some red-green deficiency, if your red-green cones are not in the right proportion, or if there's too much overlap, you might have seen that as a 3. Can you read that number on your screen? Now you have to keep in mind this is not an official test. I am not an MD, and there might be some kind of differences just based on the screen that you're using. But can you read that number? If you have normal color vision, you saw the 29 probably pretty easily. But if you have a red-green deficiency, you might have seen something else, like a 79, a 78, or a 70. What about this one? Dr. Kemp has a little bit of a red-green deficiency, and I cannot make that number out. If you have normal color vision, you probably had no problem seeing a 5. But those with red-green deficiencies might see a 3. Like I said, I basically I see nothing at all. I see some green and I see some red, but I don't see a pattern to it. Here's another one for red-green deficiency. What do you see? I can't really make that out as a number. I see the red and the green, but I don't know what that is. Normal color vision, people said, well, it's a 3, of course. If you have a red-green deficiency, you might have seen that as a 5, if you saw any number at all. Here's one. I can't see that at all. I don't know what that's supposed to be. Let's see what the screen says. It says if you have a red-green deficiency, you'll see that as a 5. See, I don't have a total red-green deficiency. I only have a weakness, color weakness. So it's kind of weird that I test even differently than some people that have this red-green deuteranopathy. Wow, what's that one supposed to be? Well, it says that if you have a red-green deficiency, you might have seen a 45. If you have normal color vision, you shouldn't see any numbers, no pattern there. You see reds and greens, but there's no number pattern. It's funny, when I was a child, 10 years old, I got taken to the doctor because my eyes, it turned out, weren't so good, and they gave me this color test. And the little slides had little numbers down in the corner. And so when they were asking me what numbers I saw, I was reading the number down in the corner because I couldn't see a number in the mix of the colors. So I really got them wrong. They thought there was something really wrong with me until they figured out I was reading the number of the slide. Like where it says image 15, I'd read a 15. Okay, what about this one? Here's a little bit different one. I see a kind of a 2 and kind of a 6, but not really well. So it says that trichromats could see this pretty easily as a 26. Again, I want you to keep in mind, this is not an official test, and there might be some differences in the way that your screen's displaying what I'm trying to project. But if you have any concerns at all, then you might want to go and request a color vision test from an eye doctor. Let's do just a couple more. Take a look. What do you see? Well, this one you're supposed to trace out a path. So trichromats can see the colors that make up the path back to the X. Start at an X and go back to an X. I can see that one pretty well. What about this path? Can you go from the left to the right? That was not too bad. I think I got it. If you trace the winding line between those two X's and you have normal color vision, then you'll connect purple and orange with the purple to the orange. But if you have a red-green deficiency, you might connect the line between the purple and the bluish-green. You might have gotten off track a little bit. I think I did that. Sometimes you see posts like this on social media where they'll say, oh, almost nobody can see this, or only people with perfect vision can see this. Now, this is actually a test of color vision that you might get, say, at a doctor's office, where they might be, say, checking if you have the right number of cones in order to be able to make a contrast. But most of the time, if you ever see this online, these are people that are trying to trick you into buying something, or they're trying to steal your information, so don't fall for it. So the previous slide said tree. What does this one say? I actually had a little bit of trouble making this one out given my green deficiency. This one says eat. Took me a second, but I can kind of focus in on that one. What about you? Do you see the word boot? That one's the word sweet. Ooh. Okay, if you look at it long enough, you ought to be able to see the word park. And again, if you see these kind of things online on social media, they claim that people can't see them. That is just totally trying to get you to look at something, and they're trying to get you off track and steal your identity or something like that. So don't fall for it. But boy, I can barely make that one out at all. I think it says love. I'm going to end this presentation with this idea that what we are calling colors is color to us humans, because if you have normal color vision, then you see between about 400 nanometers and 700 nanometer wavelengths of light, and your brain, using 3 cones, is able to, based on how much each cone vibrates when the light signal is received, interpret that as a different color between red and violet. But other animals also have cones, and they don't necessarily vibrate in the same region. Now, all humans mostly do. So about, say, 95% of the people, if you're a normal trichromat and you see something and you call it red, then most other people are going to call it red too. We do see the same colors. Now, that's not 100%, down to the last exact shade, though. A good example of that is women, on average, have more cones than men. And so women, on average, can see color a little bit better. And I've noticed, for example, in one lab that we sometimes do in chemistry, they'll see a colored flame, and the men will call it one color and the women will call it something else. So, it's between between yellow versus orange, but those two colors are real close to each other on the spectrum. But still, there is a little tiny bit of difference, but mostly, most people see colors the same way. But other animals would see different colors. Dogs, just as an example, can see what we call ultraviolet light. And so to them, the world looks very different. They don't see reds. And so they don't have very good red or green vision. It's kind of ironic. My dog likes to play with a yellow tennis ball, and they can kind of see yellow pretty well, as you can see there, but they don't really see yellow the same way that we see yellow. He'd probably enjoy his ball a lot more if I gave him a blue one. He would be able to see that a little bit better. But anyway, bees, for example, might be able to see a slightly different wavelength than you see. And so to a bee, the color of the flower might be totally different, or at least a little bit different than what it looks like to you. So insects and other mammals and anything that has eyes might see light in a slightly different way than you do. There's some insects, for example, that probably don't have cones, and they would only see in black and white, shades of gray. So the world is what we perceive it to be sometimes. The color is in the eye of the beholder. So that's just a little bit of an overview about how the eye works. Now, I, again, am not a medical expert, and I highly encourage you, if you have further questions about your own vision, to go and get your eyes checked. It's probably, for a lot of you, been over a year because you probably haven't been to the doctor a lot lately. And so let me encourage you to go get your eyes checked and to do that annually. This is Dr. Kemp signing off for now.